As I've discussed many times on this channel, the Yuuzhan Vong were arguably the greatest threat ever faced by the Star Wars galaxy. In 25 ABY, the Vong, who had completed their travel through the intergalactic void, finished their invasion preparations and pushed through Vector Prime, initiating an aggressive and devastating war, a war which would see the deaths of hundreds of trillions of beings, and which would forever change the galaxy. However, we know the Yuuzhan Vong had been mustered outside the Outer Rim for some time, and Palpatine had even been aware of their presence since at least as early as 27 BBY. So, what if the Yuuzhan Vong had kicked off their invasion during the Clone Wars, let's say in the weeks before the Battle of Coruscant? I'll be tackling this topic today by looking at the major advantages and disadvantages held by the Clone Wars era galaxy when compared to 25 ABY. Specifically, I'll be analyzing the following three categories: technology, Force users, and galactic politics. I'll cover each briefly, then present my opinion on how the war would turn out at the very end. First off, we have technology, and this is the major area where I think the Clone Wars era galaxy is disadvantaged compared to the post-Endor galaxy. Both naval and ground-based warfare had been significantly advanced by the Empire's militarization, which obviously hasn't happened in this scenario. First of all, we see significantly less warships in the galaxy, even with the CIS and Republic combined, and ships outside of these two factions were still being severely limited by the Ruusan Reformation. But when looking specifically at the Republic and CIS, we do notice a few things. First of all, dreadnoughts were much less common. The Viscount and Executor model dreadnoughts especially played a key role in the defense of major planets like Mon Calamari, as well as offenses like that at Borlias. Of course, during the Clone Wars, early superstar destroyers like the Mandator II did exist, but compared to their later cousins were very, very weak. However, my main concern here is a lack of ship variation. Because of geopolitical factors, there were only a few ship types in active service, at least above a certain weight class. For example, the Republic relied largely on Venator Star Destroyers, and this is because they had no basis for a military before the Clone Wars. Now, Venators were not only conventionally less powerful than Imperial Star Destroyers, which, by the way, would have seen some early use during the Clone Wars, but weren't very flexible. Comparatively, the military forces of the New Republic era were very varied, as individual systems were more heavily militarized. The galaxy was defended not only by the 5 fleets of the New Republic, but also the sector defense forces of the Mon Calamari, Corellians, Bothans, Hapes Consortium, and more. Systems were more heavily encouraged to defend themselves, and there were less regulations when it came to maximum ship power. On that note, one thing worth mentioning when talking about these geopolitics is that while the Chiss still does exist in the Unknown region, the Empire of the Hand, which was envisioned largely as a defensive buffer against threats within the Unknown region and beyond, will not. That's one less powerful ally for the galaxy, a galaxy where individual worlds are less powerful and able to take care of themselves. Just to reiterate, because of the massive demilitarization caused by the Ruusan Reformation. Moving on, however, the Confederacy of Independent Systems should be a very interesting enemy for the Yuuzhan Vong. We saw at, for example, the Battle of Ithor that just the presence of battle droids enraged Yuuzhan Vong warriors into a mindless fury just due to their general hate of technology. Imagine a faction which already has the capability to pump battle droids out non-stop. Besides for just being a huge terror to the Vong, the CIS would also take some heat off the Republic, as the existence of their droid foundries would likely be seen as an offense to the Yuuzhan Vong's religion. But the CIS would be important for more than just that reason. One of the major factors which led to the Yuuzhan Vong's downfall was their dwindling supply of warriors. The Vong had no problem capturing territory and could easily regrow ships and weaponry. However, warriors needed to be bred and trained, and would not be effective until their teen years. The CIS is, especially without Republic interference, very well positioned to fight a war of attrition. Let's look at the Clone Wars. Despite having far less territory than the Republic, they were able to fight a galactic war. They certainly have the potential to overwhelm an enemy who also has little territory. We also know that the YVH model of droids were incredibly effective against Vong warriors, and I think the CIS could probably come up with something almost as good. What's more, as I've discussed in prior videos, because of the Clone Wars and the terrors inflicted by droid armies, the galaxy moved away from battle droid usage and didn't have the same sort of technical capacity that existed during the Clone Wars. What's more, advanced droid production was being somewhat stymied by Palpatine, who didn't want the CIS to get too powerful. Imagine a scenario where these limits do not exist. But we'll come back to this when we talk politics. I do want to now circle back to the topic of ship strength. Republic-era capital ships are seriously worse than what was used by the New Republic and the Imperial Remnant. They had less advanced computers, worse fighters, they had lower yield turbo lasers, and the ships were more fragile. What's worse, as I alluded to earlier, there are perhaps 10,000 less Star Destroyers and however many dreadnoughts not available that were just from the days of the Empire. I really can't overstate just how disadvantaged the Republic and CIS are from a naval sense. Another disadvantage comes in a sort of weird form: the lack of advanced interdiction technology. Interdictors were very important during the Yuuzhan Vong War, and the New Republic very frequently mined hyperspace routes or used interdictor Star Destroyers. Now, interdiction technology did exist at this point, but was much more basic. While anti-Dovin basal technology, like the inertial momentum sustainer, had not been created yet. This makes winning key battles like that at EBAC 9 a little more difficult, but we'll talk about this later. Let's now move on to the topic of Jedi. Force users were one of the galaxy's greatest assets during the Vong War, so much so that the Yuuzhan Vong attempted a second Jedi purge. I think with the Jedi as a more stable presence in the galaxy and with a much stronger centralized leadership, the Yuuzhan Vong will have a much more difficult time turning the galaxy against their greatest defenders. What's more, by this point, though Jedi numbers had dwindled, remaining Knights and Masters were very used to leading soldiers in battle. Also, the government, despite being led by a literal Sith Lord, was less adversarial with the Jedi, which I think really speaks to the failure of Force Kephalia. Now, although the Vong are not touched by the Force, the Jedi nonetheless are extremely effective warriors. Jedi coordinating in battle especially are almost unbeatable. The problem with the Clone Wars was that it was spread out across the galaxy, so Jedi often weren't able to fight in extremely large numbers, just due to their deployments. However, the early Yuuzhan Vong War was essentially confined to a small part of the galaxy, and even as the Vong invaded further, they often dedicated a lot of their forces to major engagements, like those at EBAC 9 or Coruscant. Having perhaps hundreds or thousands of Jedi in a single mind meld would be an incredibly effective tool for the Republic. But on the note of the Force, I do want to briefly touch on Xenoma Sakat. It's hard to say exactly how the actions of the living planet would differ in this scenario, so I don't want to focus on it too much. However, Xenoma Sakat was missing from the galaxy at this point, but on the other hand, Anakin and Obi-Wan both had experience with the planet, so they'd be better suited to finding and understanding it than any Jedi was during the New Jedi Order. Another hard to define element is the lack of Vergir. Vergir still would have been living with the Yuuzhan Vong at this point, but who knows how she would have played into the war. If she did appear, I think she would have likely tried to contact Anakin and influence him as she did Jason. But let's move on now to the final and arguably most interesting factor: galactic politics. This is a fun one to discuss because you can make strong arguments that the galaxy would either be significantly stronger during this era or weakened to the point that they'd be steamrolled by the Vong. This is because the galaxy was in the midst of the largest war seen in thousands of years. A war orchestrated by a single person who had ultimate control of both factions. Comparatively, the galaxy was, at least from a surface perspective, much more unified during the actual Vong invasion. The New Republic controlled the majority of space and was at peace with the Imperial Remnant. On the other hand, New Republic leadership terribly mismanaged the early stages of the war. Despite being a dominant power, they did not respond to early Vong aggression and went out of their way to interfere with the Jedi Order, which was probably the only faction really doing anything. Comparatively, Palpatine knows that the Vong are a threat, he knows they exist, and he warned Thrawn about them. He's also not as stupid as Force Kephalia, and has nearly full control of the Republic because of the emergency declaration, and is also the master of Dooku, head of state for the CIS. I believe if Sidious so desires, he could unite the galaxy against the extragalactic invaders. With the war ended, or at least suspended, I think it would be interesting seeing not only how the two factions would operate together, but how the Separatists would gear up their R&D and droid productions, especially if unshackled by Palpatine, who, as I mentioned earlier, killed various secret weapons projects, which would have tipped the tides of war too far against the Republic. So, just to summarize, we have one person in control of the galaxy's military forces who, interestingly enough, doesn't have the galaxy's best interests at heart. Before I move on to my full analysis, I also want to mention that the New Republic, in the early stages of the war, limited their strategies to those that they saw as acceptable. They almost never engaged in orbital bombardment and were unwilling to use superweapons like Center Point Station. The Republic, although a democratic institution, at least in theory, existed before the Empire, and the galaxy was generally less against violent military actions. What's more, the CIS especially had a history of war crimes, and it would certainly not be against their nature to unleash bioweapons like Alpha Red. The war being significantly earlier also means that saboteurs within the government, like Nominor, would be less effective, something bolstered by the fact that Palpatine really runs everything, and he's too strong-willed to be manipulated. But let's move on to the analysis. I think if Palpatine was a benevolent ruler with the skills and assets available to him at this point in galactic history, he would very easily be able to win the Yuuzhan Vong War. Any smart ruler, which Palpatine was, would broker peace with the CIS. An existential threat like the Yuuzhan Vong is far more serious than geopolitical disagreements. Not that much negotiating would be needed, given that Palpatine again controls both powers. He would employ the Jedi, as well as military forces of both factions, to stop the Vong as they pierced Vector Prime. Importantly, the Praetorian Vong would be stopped before they could establish any sort of foothold. The Vong's advantages in space, at least given equal numbers, would be mitigated by the Republic/CIS's effectiveness on the ground, with Jedi and droids fighting together. Winning in space is important, but if the Vong can't actually capture planets, space victories will not be super useful. And remember, the Vong really don't have that many ships, and were really successful because they fought surprise attacks after they were already established within the galaxy. As the war moves on, the CIS creates Vong stomping droids, which are put into full production from secret planets. Basically, the Vong never get too far into the galaxy, are unable to grow new ships, and are pushed out and destroyed in the intergalactic void. The appropriate use of force and the fact that Jedi are now coordinating starfighters in massive numbers more than accounts for the two factions' lack of powerful dreadnoughts or star destroyers. And that's my opinion of what would happen if Palpatine was a benevolent ruler. However, we know that was far from the case, and that he was incredibly self-interested. I still do think the galaxy comes out on top in the end. However, a war where Palpatine is acting naturally is much longer and bloodier. Palpatine sacrifices planets in the Outer Rim, not unlike New Republic leadership, and allows the invasion to play out for several years. The CIS remains independent and will be defeated largely during Outer Rim sieges. However, Palpatine will have the CIS creating an unbeatable droid army in the deep core, while the Jedi are slowly whittled down in a war which has now spread across the galaxy. The core, however, is protected, and the loss of key planets will be used by Palpatine to justify even more substantial militarization and a dramatic evolution into the Empire. The Empire's saving grace will be both the delayed use of that CIS droid army and the introduction of a variety of superweapons, which Palpatine had also been secretly constructing. However, the full might available to the galaxy is not unleashed until the Jedi are nearly destroyed. Then, as he did at the end of the Clone Wars, Palpatine fakes a Jedi coup. Still, even dramatizing the war, I think Palpatine does a better job managing the invasion than the New Republic actually did, and I think he will always do at least enough to stop it from getting truly out of hand, or out of his control. So, even in this scenario, the galaxy wins, or at least that's my opinion. What do you think? I'd love to hear from you down below. Did I get this one right? Did I get this one wrong? What did you think about my analysis? And finally, what would you like me to cover in the future? Thanks again for watching, guys. As always, this has been EckhartsLadder. If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe, turn notifications on, leave a like, and consider checking me out on Twitch, Twitter, Instagram, and more. Until next time, guys, this has been EckhartsLadder. May the Force be with you.